My name is Christa Goodell. I am Technical Manager for Influenza in the Swine Division of Boehringer Ingelheim. How can we put a cost to PRDC or individual pathogens, respiratory pathogens in swine? And so the study that we did was in collaboration with Iowa State University, and we took a group, 45 groups actually, of pigs that were from across the U.S. We wanted a broad scope, and we were doing oral fluid samplings looking for the detection by PCR for influenza, PRRS, circovirus, and mycoplasma. So from that, what we found were different patterns of pathogen burden at different times throughout the grow out, and those were associated with different mortalities. And it was done with analysis, a cluster analysis, and so there was statistical significance in that information. And what was really interesting was that when you look at PRRS and influenza as examples, the patterns were, for example, very low burden, so there wasn't much flu in the nursery or the finisher, and that was associated with the lowest mortality, around 4%, similar in PRRS. The next pattern was actually where it started with a low burden, but then it increased in the nursery, and it really didn't go back to a low burden after the nursery, but the highest was in the nursery, and that was considered the highest mortality, and it ended up being over 10% for flu, and the association with PRRS was a little over 10% as well. And then the last burden, or excuse me, the last pattern was when we actually had high detection at nursery placement, but then after that there really wasn't additional exposure, and that was associated with a little over 7%, so kind of middle of the road for influenza. But for PRRS it was associated with around 5.5%, and that wasn't much different than the low burden for PRRS. And when we looked into the data, what we found was that actually that pattern 3, where we saw a high detection of PRRS at the nursery placement, was really associated with vaccine detection. And so we were really detecting vaccine, which makes sense that group had relatively low mortality compared to low burden group, because clearly those pigs were vaccinated to prevent infection, and so they were protected from any exposure that they may have had. So that made sense to us. So when we had high burdens in the nursery for both influenza and PRRS, the mortality associated with that was almost 14%. So it really re-emphasized previous work from Kara Hayden that was, even though it was in 2012 and it was retrospective, it pretty much said that individual pathogens alone, 1 + 1 does not equal 2, and that when you have combined or multiple pathogens, particularly in the nursery time frame, that's really costly to the industry. And so at the end of the day, when we want to take that back and say, how can the industry work from that, we really need to have a whole herd approach in understanding disease management so that we can better mitigate and maximize our immunity and minimize our exposure to these pathogens, so that pigs can start well and just grow from the get-go and maximize their potential growth. So that was really the take-home, as far as understanding that if we can focus on the pig, and now we've got prevents, so we can focus on vaccinating the pigs with an influenza, a live attenuated influenza, similar to what we have with PRRS, boy, those pigs will just end up taking off and really being able to perform and become full value market hogs. So if you think about it, the economics of it is, right now, that's money that we're leaving on the table, right? Because that's what the pigs are already experiencing. That's the mortality without additional preventions. But if we know that when we compare within that set of data, that there were herds that had very low burdens and their mortalities were around 4%, if we could take 14% down to a 4% by minimizing that burden, that's a significant, that's a 10% change in mortality, in overall wean to finish mortality. And I think that might be a high bar to try and achieve at the outset, because we do have to look at the whole herd. We can't start with that at the pig level, but if you have a whole herd approach and you give the pig the proper immunity and you're addressing, the gilt flow and circulation at the sow farm level, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity that the industry can achieve. The fact that we're able now to have a full portfolio and be able to focus at the pig level with all of this immunization at an early age, our influenza vaccine can be given in the farrowing house, and so it's really prior to the exposure of influenza, which gives them that immunity before they get challenged. I'm really excited to see what can become of the impact and the success for producers out there with influenza coupled with the rest of our portfolio.
This video is brought to you by Farms.com.